Yeah, I kind of wanted to talk to you about kind of the detransition thing. Like, you made an announcement a while, like not that long ago, that you were giving up on the detrans thing. And I suspect that what we think we're doing when we say stuff isn't necessarily what people hear when, or they don't. There are a lot of people that don't seem to understand. Like, I've actually heard a lot of gender critical people say you're retransitioning or you're re-identifying as a man, and it's like, I don't think that's what he means. Like,
No. Should we clarify some of that?
yeah, if you want to, I kind of wanted to get into that stuff a little bit because I kind of think that it is important, and there's so much pressure on trans people that are in this space, or transition people that are in this space, that I've noticed a lot of. There are, well, there's not a lot. There are a few people that are, they kind of, there's the I'm a desisted gay male, for like trans women that are fully, like 95% passing, have had every single surgery there is to have, like lived their lives as women, transitioned like almost 20 years ago or more than 20 years ago. And they're kind of trying to get away from the theory influence, because everybody kind of thinks that if you transition, then you transitioned to be a man or a
Right.
woman, or like that you have, like, transition equals the ideology. And it's like, no, no, there was a long period of time before the ideology came out of academia, where
Yep.
people were transitioning for very individualistic reasons. And it's those people that seem to be stumbling across what trans activism has become, being horrified, jumping on Twitter to do their bit, and then they're realizing really quick, like, within a year, oh shit, like, I don't want anything to do with this. Like, no, 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 no,
Yeah.
no. So they start kind of backpedaling a little bit, and it's understandable, but it's like, yeah, there's no, you know, once you've been on testosterone for a decade or so, detransition is virtually impossible. Like, you might be able to.
Well, that's just it, right? And that's what I've had to explore and grapple with. I haven't changed my position at all as far as some of my gender critical beliefs. I don't believe sex change is possible,
Yeah.
and I never did, right? And that's what people don't understand is when I started to testosterone, I never believed that I was magically changing sex, right? I don't believe in the Pinocchio story. So this has really been a lot of shifting language, right? I dropped the word trans man and I'm calling myself a medicalized butch lesbian because that is just a factual reality that is exactly what I am. I haven't changed my position on that at all. I guess what I was exploring is in talking to lesbians, engaging lesbians, exploring reintegration into lesbian spaces.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the part that I've abandoned. So I was never really entirely detransitioning. I mean, how much of this is actually reversible, right? I mean, I could get electrolysis on my face. That's really about the only change that I could make. The hair on my head isn't going to grow back. I'm not interested in wearing wigs. I'm not interested in any more medicalization. I'm not giving this any more of my time to medicalization. So for the rest of my life, I am going to look like a man because testosterone effects are permanent.
Yeah.
And I had some very interesting discussions about what this means in terms of lesbianism. The gender critical lesbians want men out. Does that mean that they want medicalized lesbians in? And some do and some don't. I'm interested in those conversations. I find them fascinating, and some of those conversations were really constructive. But in terms of how I live my day-to-day life, as long as I look like a man, I'm going to roll with that, right? I'm not going to go around in grocery stores and the bank and when I go get my oil change, I'm not going to start demanding that everyone calls me she, her, and ma'am, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to roll with this and with the full self knowledge that I am. biologically female and always will be. The reality, as long as the eyes and ears are telling everyone that I'm a man,
Yeah.
I'm just going to go about my life with the least disruption possible. I'm not going to go around correcting people. So my experiment was, and I mentioned this to Buck Angel recently when I was on his show, like the experiment was if we're all on the same page ideologically with gender critical feminism, then how do we actually live this in the world together in practicalities? And I think the reality is that in day-to-day practical life and the decisions I have to make, I'm not going to start walking into women's bathrooms. I'm not going to start just walking into lesbian spaces, even if those spaces did exist. I'm not just going to barge in and say I'm a lesbian because if I was invited into certain spaces, I
Mm.
may consider it, but I'm not. It just doesn't make sense. There's no going back from this.
I think there's a lot of, because a lot of this is happening, a lot of these discussions are happening on social media. So the people are alone in their homes. It's purely, I was going to say ideological, but it's purely a thought process as you're having these conversations with people. And a lot of people haven't actually been around any real life trans people. There are a lot of, like women who who are educated, who were educated in, went to college. They're now in their midlife, so they're totally fine with lesbians and gay men, but they kind of live in the straight world, and they have grabbed hold of some of the rhetoric that is floating around in this space, re what it's like to be a lesbian, or maybe they had a relationship with someone when they were in college, so they kind of think, oh, this was my community. I know all about this. But it's somewhat different in real life. Like it's very easy online to kind of see it one way and do that whole, and there's a lot of tricky rhetoric as well, like, like, well, women don't owe you femininity, like I don't need to perform femininity for you. Excuse me. That sort of, like there's a whole spectrum of womanhood. Any a woman can be anything, and like I completely agree with that rhetoric. Like that's stuff that I would say. That's stuff that I would say myself. But the reality is, once you add testosterone, you are moving into a different realm. And
Yeah,
it,
because we're male passing.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So it kind of it makes the difference. And I think there doesn't seem to be a lot of room in the social media spaces for the reality that in real life some of this rhetoric just doesn't work. Like it is all well and good, and it makes sense, and I completely agree with it. In theory, like
yeah,
when you had testosterone for a couple of decades, we've created this, like this medicalized, man-made category that kind of in a number of ways defies categorization. Like it is this weird thing. And I think like every trans person I know that is in this space is horrified. Like same as gays and lesbians, they're just horrified that this has come out of our community. Like it's just nightmarish. It churns my stomach when I think about it.
yeah,
Like every part of me is just upset about this, and horrified. And yeah, I can go on and on. But so there's a lot of pressure on us to kind of agree and go along with everything. There's just a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure, and there are people who understandably are trying to find a way to undo the damage as at the individual level. And I don't know that that's really, like, once you a transition for decades and decades, like it kind of is a ship that sailed. Like, and I think
yeah,
in a number of ways I kind of resist. I'm really lucky in that the people that I have surrounded myself with in real life have kind of came, like I was the first trans person that they had, or the first trans guy that they had interacted with in real life, and I see these people on a semi-regular basis as well. They kind of have come to similar conclusions, so I'm not under a lot of pressure to desist or detrans or anything because they know I always saw this as part of. I always conceptualize transition as a lesbian experience, as like the extreme end of butch female masculinity. Like I kind of
Mhm.
transitioned with that in mind. I knew that I would,
Yeah, I did as well.
yeah, I knew that I would pass as a guy um, to the external world. Like when I'm going down the shop for milk or something, I knew that I would pass as a guy. But in my personal life, like literally, even at work, everybody knows I'm trans. Like everybody, because I kind of I feel like I don't make as much sense if I don't tell people. At a certain point, it starts to feel like you're lying. So yeah, I've kind of been lucky in that I don't. I feel that the gut wrenching. This is disgusting. Like this is abhorrent. Like what's happening, queer theory, transitioning kids, like women's sports, the invasion of women's spaces. Like it all horrifies me. But I kind of am really lucky in that I have a lot of personal space between me and a political ideology that is attacking the mainstream.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's interesting.
And that stuff is fairly new. I mean, yes, it was trickling out of universities and was, but it was a very small subculture within the LGBT at that time.
Mm,
And I don't think any of us really expected that that would become so literal, that we would take this all so literally, that as if trans men are actually men and trans women are actually women. It's the literalness of that and the way that it's being written into law that's causing the most
yeah.
problems.
Yeah, yeah. It's how it's being written into law that is the main problem, like that it is that people are falling for this nonsense at the
Yeah.
government level. Like that's where the real damage is.
Yeah. But some of the what you mentioned, that the rhetoric doesn't really work, in terms of how we live our day-to-day lives as trans men, but aspects of that weren't really working for a lot of butch lesbians either, that we weren't performing masculinity. Like, so, I mean, as the rhetoric goes, I mean, yes, there can be a range of ways to be female, some from highly effeminate to extremely masculine or butch. But those of us who are on the extreme, just organically on the extreme end of butch, that rhetoric really wasn't working for the butches, a lot of the butches either, because we were just too masculine.
Yeah,
And that wasn't something that we were performing. I mean, I'm not much different now than I was back then, really.
yeah, same.
I mean, I've learned some etiquette of certain spaces. That part was a learning curve for me, just, walking into a men's bathroom and understanding the etiquette of those spaces, how they interact with one another, and those kinds of things I had to learn. But I'm not, as a person, I'm really not much different. I don't really
Yeah,
talk much differently. I don't think much differently. I don't dress much differently. I'm just me being myself wasn't always a really good fit in some of those
yeah, yeah.
lesbian spaces either,
We've been
especially the,
talking.
the lesbian feminist spaces,
Mm, yeah, you're too
because
male.
they always interpreted that masculinity as, well, you're just putting that on, you're just rejecting your femininity. So while on one hand they're saying, well, women get to be a whole range of things, including very masculine, but then telling me that my masculinity was just a performance, or that I was abandoning my womanhood and my femininity, or I was just trying to emulate men because I love men so much, which I didn't.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. I imagine that we were quite similar. I used to call men boys quite deliberately. It was a very conscious decision. I would call like 70-year-old men boys, because I grew up in a basically an all-female household family. Like the first few years of high school for me was a girls' high school. So I kind of I wasn't ever actually like I would never have said that I was actually a feminist, but I believed all the rhetoric anyways. So I was like the sheer level of disdain that I had for men in general, like they were just beneath my consideration. Like it was appalling in hindsight, but yeah, like the idea that you are trying to model that behavior and it's like no I'm like this is just who I am. This is how I came into the world. This is how I'll
mhm.
go out of the world. Like there's a lot of it's weird for me that lesbian spaces have have vanished because I kind of jettisoned the whole community like 15 years or more ago. I still have friends that I hang out with and stuff that are community members. But in terms of events and things like that, I almost I can't remember the last thing I went to. It was probably a decade ago. I worry that there are some rose tinted glasses that are being kind of put up, like people are being nostalgic in a way that, and it's understandable. Like I'm not, having a go at anyone, but I like when you have like a whole community of straight women watching and listening, they believe everything that you say, and then they take that and then they go away and they start telling that everywhere as though it's like 100% the God's honest truth. And it's like there are problems in, like, women are human, so we're not perfect. So the lesbian community has some toxic elements and some, when it works, it is, like, just amazingly, mind blowing. It's just the best thing ever when you're in a space of all dykes and it's pumping and everybody's getting along. It's fantastic, but that's not 100% of the time. Like there is a reason why a lot of butch women are transitioning. Like, it's a really uncomfortable space to live in. Like, people talk about gender non-conforming men copping a lot of shit, and they absolutely do, but they kind of do this thing where because I spend a fair amount of time in spaces on Twitter as well. Like, they talk about gender non-conforming women as though we're just completely accepted and there's no problems, and like it's all just everywhere you go, everybody loves you and accepts you and doesn't give you any shit. And it's like really wasn't my experience. Like I remember,
No, not at all.
mm,
No,
I
those of us that are gender nonconforming, we wear our sexual orientation
mm,
on the outside at all times, right? We can never hide that. So we tend, both effeminate gay men and masculine lesbians tend to take the brunt of homophobic violence when it does happen, or harassment when it does happen, because we can't hide our sexual orientation like
yeah,
a more heterosexual passing homo can. So a lot of us were just fatigued by that. We just got sick and tired of being treated that way. And so I consider myself still, I mean, in a tangible sense, still, I considered myself a male passing butch lesbian. That now
yeah,
I can just get on with my day. I have no anxiety leaving the house to go run errands because I know I'm not going to be harassed.
yeah, same. I thought about it exactly the same way. Like, I remember I was working at a pub bistro that was super dead. Um, so I spent a lot of my time at that job talking to now I was in my early 20s as well. This was like a number of years. No, it was the year before I transitioned. So I was 25. And there was a woman, a little, really petite, blonde, perfect figure type, um, bar manager that I used to spend a lot of time talking to. And it wasn't the first time this had happened to me, but it was the most explicit experience like this that I've had, where we were talking about, just generalized stuff, and she started talking about going out with the girls and hanging out with the girls, and she got halfway through what she was saying and she kind of half stopped as she realized that she wasn't really including me in that category, and then started to kind of backtrack. I can't remember exactly how she did it, but we both had this moment where we kind of both like at the same time realized, oh, you like my gender is lesbian. Like, I'm not female. I'm not, well, I am female, but I'm not a woman. And it was kind of like I had a lot of those experiences as I was coming into adulthood and in my early stages of adulthood before I transitioned. I had a lot of experiences like that where it was like, you are excluded from, the sisterhood. Like, sorry, but your access stops here. So it's kind of been concerning to me watching a number of trans guys and his sisters as well, like, just watching this unfold on social media in front of me, watching people really wanting to believe that they can make their way back to the lesbian sisterhood. Um, and I wish it was possible, but I think it is possible in some ways, but I don't think that it's possible as an absolute. And I think that people are saying a lot of this rhetoric, meaning like just having the best of intentions, meaning what they say, but because they're not around many trans guys, they don't really realize that we're going to raise their hackles as soon as we walk into a lesbian
Yeah.
woman-owned space. They're not going to go,
Well, I think a lot of the reasoning for the rhetoric really is more focused on keeping
yeah,
the trans women out of those spaces, not really intending or wanting us back in.
yeah.
But
And
I mean, it's
I think
not
that's
like
fair.
lesbians are all on the same page and never have been. I mean, lesbianism has never been a utopia. It's always been fraught with infighting and
Messy.
messy and polarized views about these things. So there's no lesbian utopian space, period, and not all lesbians are going to be on the same page about including us or not including us. But I think those that say, trans men are women, their focus for the most part is on that the trans women are men, and I think it's a little bit of a rhetorical game on their part, to say things that we belong under the banner of lesbian and we belong under the banner of feminism, but their focus and concern and interest isn't
Yeah.
really about us, even though we do share some aspects of oppression as trans men. I mean, I have worked with a lot of trans youth who transitioned because of sexual violence or experienced sexual violence as trans men, and there hasn't really been much notice or concern for trans men. I think applications of feminism would be really helpful to address those kinds of things, but that isn't really I guess it just doesn't always come across as sincere.
Yeah, I don't think that they're thinking it through in reality as much as they seem to think. I think you're right. They're mainly focused on trans women, keeping trans women out of female sports and female spaces, etc., and the female category in general. And we're kind of tacked on as an afterthought in a number of ways. It kind of I worry about this a lot. I worry about this area a lot because there are a lot of people who will want to go back. So we need to find a happy medium so those
Yeah.
people can exist. Because the other thing is there are more transitioning or more medicalized people now than there ever have been before. Like the youth demographic has something like 20 or 30% LGBTQI,
Yeah.
blah, 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 identification. So even like people and like they're the gender critical mob, for lack of a better word, because they're like that just spans so, so far. They kind of talk about this ending and even like that, and they're talking about this wave of detransition that we all expect to happen. I think absolutely it will happen.
I
But
do
even
think so too.
after a massive wave of desistance and detransition, there's still going to be more medicalized people than there have been in any other
Yeah.
generation. Like, we're going to have to deal with this stuff for some
Yeah.
time to come, like,
Yeah.
probably forever. The idea that this is just going to go away or we're going to stop it completely is, I mean, it's a lovely thought, and my positions have changed pretty dramatically, and I'm kind of a lot more conservative and hardcore at this point. Like when you look at society as a whole, I'm like, I think this has been
No.
really detrimental. I don't think that it's just trans related. Like, I think it's highly politicized, but there are two or three generations of people who have been and who are being indoctrinated into queer theory on a daily
Mhm.
basis right now at the like 5 year olds that are growing up that are being told that gender and their sex body is a performance. Like they're
Yeah.
going to grow up believing this stuff, being told this stuff, and presumably some of them are going to transition as well. Like this is
I
going.
noticed because I spent some time in a lesbian only space this summer. I was invited in. It wouldn't have occurred to me to just show up. I was invited in specifically to have this conversation of what will this look like in the future if medicalized lesbians do want to start to reintegrate. And I noticed a big generational divide that the younger, like 20 to 30 something year olds, were so excited and grateful that I was there to have that conversation because they're seeing so many of their friends
Yeah,
medicalized, and not even the butches, but just lesbians in general. And that was what I was seeing in my clinical practice too, is that just lesbians in general are transitioning. So because so many are transitioning, I think they're going to have to grapple with this, and they know that. Whereas the older ones, they kind of feel like, okay, the ship has sailed. You made this choice, bugger off. And most trans men don't want back either. So
mm,
some of the older lesbians really struggled with having me there. Some were very much engaged in the conversation, but my read is the majority were pretty uncomfortable that I was there. And just to even start to think through it. I mean, because they're so desperate to protect their spaces from the infiltration of men because of gender identity ideology
yeah,
and then you add that premise of, well, having a passing trans man walk in. Like, if you can't trust your eyes and ears, how do you protect those spaces? How do you let passing trans men in but keep men out? Like, so it's such a huge dilemma.
mm,
And I think, understandably, a lot of the older lesbians are kind of freaked out by that premise. But the younger ones, they are so desperate to have their friends back. They don't have lesbian community unless they get their friends back because so many
yeah.
have medicalized.
Scary thought. I still can't get my head around. I saw this video of, I think it was a Blair White video, but I can't remember. Like, no, it wasn't. Someone stopped what appeared to be either a lesbian couple or two very close friends on the street and started asking them something. And the very feminine present, like this woman was like two steps away from Barbie, except she was a brunette. Like this woman could not have been more feminine. Like she was as femme as it gets. And she started talking about how she's non-binary. Like they asked about something, and she started saying, "Oh no, I'm a she they because I have boss parts of my personality. So like I'm non-binary because I have a bot like kind of a boss bitch type personality." And it's like
Right. So because she's not submissive, she's partly man. I know
like
it's
what are you talking about? Like I still can't get my head around that. And some of the detransitioners from the last wave, so like Kat Cattinson, even Grace, like women who are really feminine, like just petite feminine girls being given testosterone and being allowed to transition. It's just like it just blows my mind. Like I
Which
can't.
just goes to show that clinicians have no idea what gender dysphoria is,
Yeah,
right? They no idea. And that's why it was so clear to me as a clinician that things have gone off the rails because I already knew what gender dysphoria was, right? It was highly gender nonconforming lesbians or gay men in terms of the childhood cohort.
yeah,
And so many of the young people that I was seeing and talking to their families, like it was mostly girls that I saw, about 70% girls. Most of them were same-sex attracted, but most of them weren't gender nonconforming at all and never had been. They just adopted a trans identity, and families would confirm that my daughter had always been very feminine, felt comfortable in dresses. That is not childhood onset gender dysphoria. It just
yeah,
isn't. And I couldn't have hidden that. It was very obvious to everyone around me as a child, even when I was forced to wear a dress in which I looked absolutely miserable and angry. But it was obvious to everyone around me that I was gender nonconforming, and I never said out loud, I think I'm a boy. I mean, that part I kept to myself, but it wasn't a surprise to anyone.
that was
Yeah.
surprised. My family was surprised that it was possible that transition from female is is possible.
Yeah.
But yeah, they weren't really surprised at all. Like I had my best friend from high school got married and we were super close, super, super, super close. So she of course asked me to be her bridesmaid without really thinking it through. And it was one of those social situations. This was a couple of years before I transitioned, and it was just like this super awkward. Like I dreaded the thought of it. Like I was just like, oh my God, this is going to be horrific. But I did it. She was my best mate. So, of course I did it. Took one on the chin. There's video footage of me, like, because it was the only time I ever wore makeup or heels, and they were only like little heels. But there's video footage of me kind of swaying when we're standing at the altar because I couldn't stand up straight. But actually, one of her male relatives, like one of her great uncles or her uncles or some male relative of hers actually came up to me. They kind of do this spontaneous utterance where they bump into something that they can't process. So they say something really stupid out loud, and he kind of said something to me along the lines of, like you look like a man in a dress, like you look like you're in drag. And
Yeah.
thankfully, she was my
Yeah.
best friend from high school, so there were a whole heap of people that knew me really well. That as soon as we got there, they were like, "Oh, dude, don't worry about it. We'll put this one in the vault." Slap me on the back, and like we just got on with the day.
Yeah.
But like everyone in my generation who transitioned was not just a little bit gender non-conforming, like
Yeah.
it was a serious daily issue for them to
Yeah.
like to be butch women, like to be super
Yeah.
masculinized women. It's hard as well because like the kinds of butches that we're talking about. Like there's Julie Bindel type masculinized women. I don't know that I doubt that she would see herself as a butch. I don't
I
really
don't know. I teased her about
I,
that, and
I
no, she
yeah,
doesn't.
yeah, no. But I mean, she's kind of like a soft butch, like, and people talk about tomboys, like, like you can always tell that it's a girl, and everybody has seen that. Everybody knows that. So when they're talking about tomboys and, like Vicky, that I was just watching your video with her earlier, like
Yeah.
she's clearly kind of masculinized, like she's into boy stuff, even though she's got long hair.
Mhm.
But you can still tell that she is a woman. There's people where, like if you kind of glanced at them and kept walking, you might mistake them for a man. But the moment your eyes focus on them, you're like, oh, that's a woman. But there is a small cohort of women where it's like, no, no, you can get right up close, be
Yeah.
standing like 2 meters away, and still think that they are men. And until they open their mouths,
Yeah.
that's when you find out because their voice is a lot higher than you're expecting it. And they're like, oh, shit, 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 shit.
Yeah. I've known witches like that too, who even have like facial hair, and
Yeah.
they look like men.
So it kind of
I was
makes,
going to say, just picking up the point about the rhetoric, and then try and the challenges with applying it. I think there has always been a disconnect between theoretical feminism and grassroots feminism, and I would say that when in my years that I was in those spaces, we were more grassroots. There were some academic dinner circles, but we were more grassroots organizers, and that's where there's a huge disconnect. I mean, I agree with many of the ideas in principle and on paper. I think one of my frustrations with a lot of the gender critical rhetoric right now is it's on Twitter and it's in articles, it's in books, it's part of the public conversation, but so few people are actually trying to address it at a grassroots organized level. And that's where we run into problems, right? And that's exactly the work that I was trying to do. I'm so far ahead of that curve, talking to the lesbians about, well, what would this look like to reintegrate medicalized lesbians back in if they're male passing? But that is where the hard work is, and that's my frustration. 95% of people talking about it theoretically, and very few people actually trying to grapple with the day-to-day lived reality of that and the spaces. And that's always been the case with activism, that academic activism and grassroots activism
not the same.
rarely interact, and it rarely works together. I remember my first long-term partner, she was an academic, but she was also very much into grassroots activism. And so that was a tension that she always felt with, because she'd go to the university and discuss these ideas, but most of those academics weren't really involved in grassroots activism. And then she'd hang out, with me and the grassroots activists, kind of flipping the bird to the academics, because they felt the academics were out of touch with the day-to-day reality and just the practicalities of actually living those principles out. And so she was involved in, and I helped her a little bit with it to organize a conference. This would have been in the early 2000s at UBC. I was staff at UBC at the time, and we organized this conference to bring grassroots activists and academic activists together. And the academics were saying this is not going to work. But it ended up working beautifully to actually have a dialogue between those two streams of activism
Mm.
to talk about, to give feedback to one another, right? So that the academics could hear certain principles sounded great in theory, but weren't actually working when you tried to apply them, right? And so there has to be that dialogue back and forth that then informs the theory, and then the theory goes back to the grassroots. So that ball has to be passed back and forth
Mm.
continuously in dialogue, or they're just abstract ideas that
Yeah. I,
that don't really go anywhere, and it frustrates everybody. And so there's that point. But I also wanted to ask you, you said you were never a feminist. I mean, I was, and I still believe in the theory, still believe in women's rights and women's spaces. But what was it like for you? Because I didn't like men either. I grew up with very macho men, cowboys, farmers, truckers, very macho men that I didn't always get along with. They often infuriated me. So I entered into feminist lesbian spaces. I would say, for the most part, I was a lesbian separatist for throughout my 20s. And when I transitioned, that was a big challenge for me. Well, even as a butch lesbian, that was a challenge for me. It's like, how do I reconcile my masculinity with my, lesbian feminist principles and my dislike of men? And that's something I really had to address internally for myself when I transitioned and I started to appear as a man, started to occupy more male spaces. I remember I was at a conference really early in my transition, and it was a conference of trans men in Vancouver. I don't know, I'm guessing about 40 trans men sitting in a circle, and we started just telling a bit about our personal stories. And I remember feeling so apologetic about my masculinity and about the men that I grew up with. And there was a trans man, an older trans man sitting behind me when I was talking kind of disparagingly about the cowboys that I grew up with. And he said, "I really love cowboys." And it sort of took me back. It's like, wait, because I just assumed, because so many of us at that time, we
mm.
weren't medicalizing as kids. So many of us at that time were coming out of lesbian spaces. The majority had been feminist. So I was just sort of reading the room, assuming that everyone would, feeling
Come
like I had to be
in place.
apologetic in this circle, right? So when he said that, it's like, it almost jarred me, because it's like, so it's an option to like men, like
Yeah.
that's a thing, that's permissible. But that was actually a really pivotal healing moment for me, to accept my masculinity, accept my male presentation, and accept a brotherhood amongst men. And I mean, there's still types of men, there's still types of, as I opened myself up to the possibility that there were men worthy of my respect and my time and my friendship. And I found groups of men who I really learned to appreciate and respect, who I think were really amazing human beings. Like, for example, I was part of a small group with my church, and I was just so used to rough working class men who, as soon as you get them together, they're aggressive and they're vulgar, and
Mm.
they're speaking awfully of their girlfriends or their wives. And I had no time for that. But this circle of men that I met in my church was so healing for me, because they were really good human beings who never said anything disparaging about their wives. They all had really healthy relationships with their wives. And they were able to be vulnerable and emotional. And so we would get together, and I mean, some of it was Bible study, but we were just there to care for one another, to share our hearts with one another, to be vulnerable, to be emotional, to ask for support and mentorship from one another. And it was just so loving and supportive and warm. And I'd never really experienced that
Yeah.
from men before.
It's a revelation, isn't it?
It is.
I previously, like, I really, like, I could not have disrespected men as a category in my mind more than I did. Like, I wasn't ever a separatist. I just didn't, like, I really didn't. My dad kind of bolted when I was 4. He was kind of like a man child in a number of ways, and I never really connected with him. And because I was so young, I never noticed the loss either, because I was like, this is just my reality. I have my mum. And then my brother left. My brother is 6 years older than me. So growing up, he was always a bit of a dick. And then he left home when he was 12. So I would have been like 6 or 7 or something like that. So I really grew up in a pretty much a female only environment. Came out as went to an all girls school for a couple of years. Then I kind of moved a few hundred kilometers up the coast and went to a co-ed school. And it's like at that point you're in your nine and puberty has set in, and boys are have like an overwhelming amount of testosterone coursing through them that they can't yet control, that is overwhelming them. So you kind of like like you're a dickhead, go away. And then I just never checked back in. I was never like, oh, maybe they grow out of that phase. Like I was just like, I'm done, like not interested. And when I transitioned, I kind of really expected, because I lived right in, like, Newtown is basically the core lesbian suburb, or it was at that point. And the Sydney University is like a kilometre up the road. I kind of really expected to stay in that LGBT bubble. Like I wasn't super. I'm not very sociable, so like I wasn't ever like a community mainstay, or like I just would go to things from time to time. Um, but I kind of really expected that I would stay in that what has become queer community, and that didn't turn out to be the case. What did happen? And I mean, you're interacting with guys at work, like, because I worked the entire way. So you're constantly bumping into individual men who you really like, who you get along with, like who, go out of their way to do good things for you, like to support you and respect you. And like for some reason, we always focus on the one worst case scenario and ignore hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interactions that are overwhelmingly positive from men that would that are almost incapable of hurting anybody unless it was to protect themselves or other people. Like we seem to ignore all of the good interactions, but slowly over time, as I started to transition, I kind of expected that I never wanted to be part of the social category of men. So, like when they kind of pair off, or they, like a group of guys go to check out someone's brand new motorcycle, I would hang back and just assume that I wasn't invited, and they get like 6 steps away, and someone would turn around and go, "Are you coming? Come on, like get over here. You're interested in this." Um, so it kind of took me a long time. Like it probably took me a decade or more. It wasn't until I bumped into Abigail Schreier's book that this kind of settled in my mind properly. But like as they let you in, and just the assumption is that you're one of them and that you're welcome and you have an all access pass, like you can, they'll just say what they're going to say. They'll, if they're upset about something, then they'll talk about it in front of you, blah, 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 like that. Like you just are part of that group. It kind of slowly started to dawn on me that there are patterns, and that there are things that you don't do, things that like there's rules, there's
Yeah.
expectations, there's
Yeah.
courtesy. Like you see someone whose wife had died of cancer or something, who just suddenly kind of starts shutting down. and you'd notice someone from the other side of the group who doesn't speak much would suddenly be right next to that guy whose wife just died, and they'd be going fishing together, or they'd be going bike riding together, or like they would just automatically care for each other.
Mhm.
um, and I started to realize, because like when you're looking at it from a lesbian perspective, like you've got a lot of you know feminist rhetoric happening, or statistics and rape. Like I really expected pre-transition. I really thought that men were hairless apes that dragged their knuckles on the ground. Like I really just really just thought they were idiots, basically.
I did too.
So coming into transition, and then slowly over time, bumping into more and more and more guys who are really sweet, and they're really caring, and they care about what you think. Like they kind of get around you. What was this? And then seeing them care for each other, like you start to recognize what their socialization is, what the rules are, and why they are the way that they are. Like
Mhm.
there's a lot of, like I work in a factory at the moment, and there are a lot of guys in their 60s, and they're like really rough old, like bikey type, big beards, and they have like leather vests and stuff when they go home, who drive forklifts all day. And it is the most mind-numbingly boring, repetitive job that anyone could do. Like it's not fulfilling, it's not a career. They just do it for the money, like, and they
Yeah.
do it and they have pride in their work because they are providing for their family. And that is
Yeah.
the most important thing in their life. Like, and you hear them talking about their wives and their kids, and they just adore them. Like they would do
Yeah.
anything. They would take a bullet. They'd step in front of a truck without thinking. And that I kind of started to realize over time that, yeah, men have overall, like the feminists are right in that men have more privilege than women. Like they get away with a bit more social freedom. Like they have less, they have less strings attached to them in terms of things that they are capable of doing. But they also have a shit ton more responsibility, and their value resides in their ability to sacrifice themselves, like sacrifice their wants, sacrifice their needs, sacrifice their dreams, because their girlfriend, they got their girlfriend pregnant and they wanted to go to university and do this, and now they've got to go and get a job and support their partner, and they'll spend the next 40, 50 years working in a job that they detest because that's their
Mhm.
responsibility. Like I see far more of that than I do men saying, it generally is young men saying really dumb shit about women, in my experience. Like, unless I've seen a few older guys go off and say horrific shit, but generally it's because they're really upset. B, they feel backed into a corner, and C, they don't mean it. They're blowing off steam, like,
Yeah. A lot of them are resentful. I have had
yeah,
so many men. I do have some men in my life, and I've had so many of them. There's a song by an art performance artist named Dax, Dax, and he has a song about basically about male depression. And I've had so many men slide that into my DMs, as a way of expressing that they just feel like their spirits are crushed. They want intimacy, emotional intimacy with their wives. They want to feel encouraged and cared about, and they're
yeah,
they're craving so much, and but they feel duty bound. They feel like they have to just go through the motions of being the provider, being, they're just playing out a role, and they feel really unsatisfied. And what they've said to me is whenever they've tried to be more emotionally vulnerable with their wives, or play them that song, their wives berate them. It's like, what the fuck? Are you depressed? Stop being a sissy, right? And they don't, they want to do things differently, but they feel trapped in a box. And
Yeah,
I've seen that pattern over and over and over again. My dad is a lot like that, and I've it's been interesting because my dad and I wouldn't say we hated each other, but we butt heads a lot. We spent a lot of time together when I was a kid, but we butt heads. We have such similar personalities. Like we were two rams always butting heads. And I always saw him as just a macho, entitled, controlling asshole. And I saw my mom as a victim of that, that she was more fragile. And I mean, she would say shit to me. But over this past couple of years, because I moved back here, my dad, when things blew up in for me in BC with the trans activists, my dad said, just come home for a while, just land here, get back on your feet. So that's what I did. My dad was living a block away up until recently. I was apprehensive about that. I thought, oh shit, like I'm going to go home and we're going to just be fighting the whole time. But he had left my mom recently at that time and had started seeing someone else and the difference in him. And so we've been talking a lot because my marriage had just ended. He had just left my wife. So we were kind of supporting each other through that process. And he started opening up and talking about how things looked from his perspective and how my mom's mental health issues were such a big problem. She was so chaotic. She was often very cruel. She cheated on him over and over and over again throughout that whole relationship. Like she was just this this wild, out of control person. And he said, I mean, I felt like I had to be more controlling. Like she would have just completely, in her chaos, she would have just created chaos for our entire household. Like, so he said, I felt like I had to be almost a father figure in a way in order to just try to keep some stability and structure for the kids and to make sure all the bills were paid and just to try to contain her wild behaviors and how hurt he was by so many of her behaviors. That's not something I ever saw in him, right? I never saw that vulnerability in him and that so much of his behavior was in response to her behavior. So now I see it very differently because my mom's mental health issues have gotten worse and worse and worse over the years. So I've absolutely seen it firsthand
yeah,
and now see it from his perspective. And I played out that pattern in my last marriage where, you know, I was with someone that, yeah, was just creating that chaos. And I mean, we would have been broke. We would have been bankrupt. We would have lost our home. Had I not been more
yeah.
controlling, and I wouldn't say that as a personality type prior to that, I wouldn't say that I was a very controlling person, but so I started to understand it from his perspective that it takes two to tango, right? And when you feel like someone is creating absolute chaos and havoc and
Mm,
devastation to your life, if you didn't start to kind of control the money and try to create some structure and step in and kind of overcompensate,
yeah,
which isn't a healthy dynamic. And I should have just left, right? Rather than developing that relational pattern. But I did. It's not like it was all bad. I mean, the aspects of our relationship were awesome. And I did love her. So I stuck it out as long as I could. But then I developed a very similar relational pattern that he did, right? And it didn't come from a bad place.
mm,
So we've really bonded a lot. And seeing him in this new relationship with a woman that doesn't have mental health problems, she's amazing, very strong woman, and seeing her push back on him, right? It's like, well, fuck off or get out of my kitchen, or like she can stand her ground. And I'm seeing him sort of because he trusts her, because she's competent and
yeah.
capable and
Sorry.
not crazy, that he's softening, right? And he's now more vulnerable and more gentle. And so I mean, I see it from, I've lived life as both male and female in a sense, not literally, but in those social spaces and being perceived male. I'm seeing it from both perspectives that men who I had once like I hated my dad for many, many years. I just thought he was such a controlling asshole. And he was like and he admits at times he was too heavy-handed about it. He was a bit of a drill sergeant at times and too heavy-handed, but he said I was just trying to cope. I was just trying to keep my feet on the ground and my head on my shoulders. I was trying to provide stability for for you kids. I was just trying to cope. And she hurt me so badly over and over and over again, but he thought it was his duty, right, to stick with her and try to support her. And so we find ourselves sometimes in these
Yeah.
relational dynamics, right, that draw out or, certain personality habits, or we develop certain personality habits.
Yeah, I kind of think it's really interesting, and I think that this is an area where trans people have a real opportunity to make a difference in that, like, we were raised as women, we're female, hello, we were raised as women, but throughout our adult life, we moved into a different space via testosterone and transitioning that opened up a different world and a different view of the world.
Yeah.
I have a lot of compassion for men in general now. And I think that one of the fundamental mistakes at the heart of feminism is that they assume that they know where men are coming from. It's that is it James Baldwin quote about the boot on the neck? Like, there's a quote where he's like, I as a black American slave or whatnot, I have had the white man's boot on my neck for hundreds of years at this point, so I know everything about him. The feminists
Yeah.
kind of adopted that kind of philosophy or mindset, um, and the reality is that I don't think they have it right in a lot of places. Like, men are not trying to oppress women. Like, they know that they are physically stronger, faster. They feel a sense of responsibility. They feel like their job is to protect. And historically, they're right. Like, it's only been in the last century that, like, we don't have a very long view of history. We have a very modern, disjointed, fragmented outlook on our lives and history and the world in general. Like, it's only been really for the last 5 minutes that the human experience has been comfortable or wealthy at all for this many people. Like, we are the luckiest humans that have ever existed. Like, it just is insane. But instead of thinking about what we have, we think about, all of the little problems and think that we can fix them all. And it's like,
Yeah.
I don't think we can. It would be lovely if we could, but like, part of the thing of trans ideology and the left in general going too far is trying to create a utopic, pain,
Hmm.
suffering free existence on the planet, like on Earth, which is the most compassionate, lovely, idealistic, wonderful ideal, but it's not realistic. Like, there's
Yeah.
always going to be problems. There's always going to be suffering. So I kind of think, in a number of
Yeah.
ways, it would be better to, teach kids and, like, acknowledge that there are problems and that life comes with pain and suffering, and prepare people for that and make sure they're resilient enough to cope with that, than try and wrap us all in cotton wool, which is
Yeah.
kind of what's at the heart of all of the politics that are happening at the moment. I kind of see the trans thing as one arm of you know a leftist progressive Marxist attempt at takeover. Black Lives Matter, the climate
Yeah.
justice, as if you can get justice for the climate. Like, how does that work? Like, there are a number of extreme left wing political movements at the moment that are setting their sights at destroying Western civilization and capitalism all at the same time, and they're decades ahead of us, and
Yeah.
they've had time to make sure that they're very effective. Yeah, it's been very interesting though, because it's so unlikely as well. Like, that I now have a serious amount of compassion for men in general is like, if you had told me, even 5 years into transition, that I would end up being, kind of very sympathetic to men in general, I would have.
I didn't think that would ever happen to me either. Like I said, I mean, I absolutely hated the men that I grew up with. But and then when I did learn some feminist theory and was hanging out at feminist spaces, it intensified that hatred towards them. And I guess what I'm recognizing now is my role in the headbutting with my dad. And yeah, I have a friend, she's so good with me. Like she really understands me and how my head works. And I mean, she knows things like I'm always kind of lost in sort of thought threads. And so she'll do these things. Like she just has a way of knowing how to when she needs me to hear her or do something. Like she just has a way of catching my attention to kind of snap me out of whatever it is my mind is going off on. And she just has a way of bringing my focus onto her and then explaining exactly what she needs me to do. Like she just works with me. So she understands how my brain works. But one of the things she said to me, because I was acknowledging some macho-ness in how some of my traits have developed, especially after that last relationship. And she said, so I was owning that. And she said, Aaron, it's because you don't feel safe.
Mm,
And it's like, well, yes, that's exactly it. Because what that is, it's an armor. And in this time that I've spent with my dad over the last couple of years, realizing that that's exactly what it was for him too, right? He didn't feel safe. He didn't feel safe, with the chaos my mom was creating. He didn't. There were a lot of reasons why he just wasn't feeling safe. And when I would come at him, from that feminist mindset of just hating him and hating those characteristics about him, then he also didn't feel safe, right? He felt like it hurt him that his own daughter didn't love him, right? And so it does take two. And I think that's something that the feminists don't always understand is that the way they interact with men may actually be drawing some of those less desirable characteristics out of them
yeah,
if they're not developing emotional intimacy with them and in both directions, a deeper understanding of why it is they behave that way in the first place. And like I said, I'm seeing my dad change so much because he's in a new relationship where she can stand up for herself, but they also have a lot more, they talk a lot and they have a lot more emotional intimacy. So that armor is falling off of him.
yeah,
And that's something women don't always understand is sometimes they are interacting with men in a way that they feel like they have to armor up. And
mm,
then they hate those men for armoring up.
yeah, yeah. I let's not get onto the subject of feminism, but I have a really hard time with how to be pro woman without feminism because I really like. I just like. There's not much of it that I actually don't reject because I just think it has done untold damage, and I think that. I think in a number of ways, in terms of the trans ideology, I remember like the first episode, the first podcast we ever did together was the transparency one, um, which was one of the early transparency podcasts. And Helen Joyce's book hadn't come out at that point, but she'd started doing press, and I was so excited. Like I was really excited about the prospect of her book being released and what she had to say. And then the book came out, and I was ultimately really disappointed. I think she has, in a really strange way, I think she has framed the trans, like the gender critical view, as in it's from here to here, and this is what the problem is, and nothing else has contributed. And she hasn't there's a lot of disjointedness because like people will be like, yeah, yeah, Marxism, yeah, 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 academia, yeah, 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 the humanities, yeah, 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 yeah. And then they go to the medicalization stuff, like they don't ever go, okay, so what part of the humanities in academia and how Marxism, like like let's get to the bottom of that. And I've seen videos where she did a video. Helen Joyce did a video. She zoomed into a conference with Abigail Favali, who is a reformed Catholic who has a PhD in gender studies, and she's kind of ripping the lid off. Like she is now using her gender studies slash women's studies degree to kind of rip the lid off gender ideology and some of the problematic, or unhelpful stuff that is built into feminism. And even just watching the first 10 minutes of that is amazing, because it starts with Abigail. The host goes, "So how do we get here?" And Abigail goes, "Well, Mary Wollstonecraft, Simone de Beauvoir, blah 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 blah," and just went all the way through feminist history and how it has. She kind of bypasses Kate Millett and blank slate stuff, but she kind of just went bang, 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 bang. Like, this is how feminism has feminist academics have contributed to gender ideology. And they cut to so she said her, 5-10 minute thing, and then they cut to Helen and was like, "Do you have anything to add?" And Helen's like, she just summed it up perfectly, like bang on the bullseye. But we kind of it's hard because people hear that as you want to blame women, and it's like, no, we just have some philosophical problems here that we need to dig to the bottom of. It's not about blaming people isn't helpful in any way, shape, or form when it comes to resolving issues and fixing problems. Like, we actually need to put all of these ideas on the table and start sifting through them and figuring out, what we can keep and what we need to jettison. So
I was really, when I was growing up, I was really close with my grandma, and she was a very strong personality. She definitely ran that household, but she was a strong farming woman, and she hated men. Her advice to me when I was a kid was, she said, of course, she didn't know I was a lesbian at that time. So she said, she said, marry an ugly man because a good-looking man is going to treat you like shit.
oh wow.
And yeah, she had a very low opinion of men, and I don't know why. I don't know sort of the context if something had happened that formed that opinion, but my grandpa was a very gentle man. He was very quiet and kind of goofy, had a great sense of humor, and she would never say anything nice to him, right? It's almost like, if I give you an inch, you're going to use it against me, right? She had that very, almost a very feminist point of view, right? Is that you are going to oppress me unless I keep my thumb on you at all times. And she would just play all kinds of mind games with them, and would never ever, like, absolutely no warmth towards him at all. And when my grandpa, he developed health problems and died fairly young, but he went through like a dementia as he was towards the end of his life. And in his dementia, you could see his resentment and rage kind of coming out at her, just that I think he wanted warmth with her. I do think he loved her, but you
Yeah,
could see, yeah, once he had dementia and couldn't contain that. Like, I think he was very reserved and was really able just to contain that resentment and contain that anger and sadness. But when he was demented, he couldn't. And it's, yeah, it
yeah,
got kind of messy towards the end of his life, seeing that part come out of him, because he was always such a gentle man. I actually really liked him. But at that
yeah.
time, I was a man hater too. So my grandma and I hit it off really well.
I kind of like everyone in, because my mum is one of nine and there are only three boys, and one was out, like her oldest brother was actually out of the house by the time she was a baby. Because my mother's mother, I worked it out, like she was in her mid 40s when she had my Aunt Kay, who was the youngest child. My mum is the third youngest. Um, so there are just all of these, and they're all boomers. So my mum was born in 47. And my aunt was born in early 50s. So they're all kind of post-war babies for the most part, all of the ones that I had close relationships, and they're all women. Like, they're all women, for the most part, because I didn't have anything to do with my uncles. And they're all like just fiercely intelligent, opinionated. Like in my family, like in my extended family on my mother's side, it kind of felt like when I was growing up, it kind of felt like men were seen and not heard. Like they just, like they were spoken Like they wouldn't even speak up. They would just sit down the end of the table and talk amongst themselves and not bother anybody. It was kind of weird. But all of my aunts were like they were highly opinionated, highly intelligent, highly capable, and they knew they were all high, like they knew it as well. So they're all formidable in their own ways. But they also kind of, it's not like they were submissive. They all had traditional marriages. So their view, if you asked them, would have been, well, I need to submit to my husband. But it kind of worked out in the open. It kind of looked more like an equal partnership, and they both had different roles, and they understood that he understood what his role was, and my aunts understood what their role was, and it worked for them for the most part. Nobody got divorced, and they're now all at the point of dying, still married. And I really love Camille Puglia as well. So it's kind of like, how do I really struggle with this. It's like, how am I pro woman as a female who's transitioned while being, deeply skeptical of just kind of the oppressive narratives that are like in overall when it comes to feminism. Like, because yeah, there are some really shitty things that men have done and men do at the individual level. But then you kind of think about like, because we're kind of coming into a very, it feels like we're coming back into a traditional, Western period of, like kind of getting back to our roots. Biology, like biological differences are being spoken about a lot. Like Carrie Gress talks about in the beginning of her book, it's called The End of Woman, how feminism has failed us. It's really interesting. She's talking about, like, she talks about a woman who is pregnant and alone and gives birth to a baby in like the 15, 16, 17, 1800s or something, and they both freeze to death because there's a broken window. And she talks about some of the structural inequality that feminism has tried to address because there is some structural inequality. And she kind of points out, Carrie kind of points out in a number of ways, it's because of our biology. Like giving birth to babies makes both mother and child incredibly vulnerable. And there's just no way around that. That is the way that we reproduce. So if you're kind of thinking about us like structuring society in a way like protect mother and child, like in the best, most effective way possible, like the father
Mhm.
is, like that is the structure that makes the most sense. And the problem is that it works really well so long as you have a husband that likes and loves and appreciates you, and a wife who responds in who reciprocates. Like there are structural problems, but they do seem to be very biological in nature, and our biology
Yeah.
isn't changing anytime.
Well, I mean, those structural problems are compensations for individuals that aren't taking personal responsibility, right? And so we kind of have to be doing both. I think people need maybe more support to take personal responsibility and to develop the skills of healthy relationships. And
Yeah, I struggle with that a lot because it's like I really don't. Yeah, I don't. A lot of if you go stretching, like Betty Friedan presented herself at the like when she wrote her book, she presented herself as a simple housewife who was like, and she called the home a comfortable concentration camp or something. The reality is that she was a lifelong Communist Party member who was an agitator all her life. So I think she had a degree in psychology or psychiatry, that she used to great effect. When you go looking at the history of how like it all developed and look at the individuals and the reasons like why they did the things that they did, you come I I came away cold. Like I was like,
Mhm.
that's not good. Um, so I'm kind of trying to unravel what it would look like to be, support women, support men, and be reality based on that front. And it's a bit of an internal struggle, but
Yeah. I feel like some of that structural support, I mean, kind of going back to the early part of our conversation when we're saying, that there are some who believe that trans men belong under the concerns of feminism, and we do share some experiences that are common among women, like sexual assault. I've known and like worked with on a clinical basis quite a few young trans men who were kind of setting themselves up for situations like that, like Craigslist dating where they would meet some anonymous man somewhere and they would end up being sexually. Like I saw that kind of stuff a lot with young trans men and just putting themselves in these really risky situations. And there's really no structural support for them. I mean, we hear all the time about trans women wanting into rape crisis centers for women and the problems with that, but we're not really talking about, well, what are the structural supports for trans men who are experiencing female typical oppression? It's really missing.
I would still say that I think that as a category, trans men are part of, we are a subset of the lesbian community. I don't think that we're, how do you put it? Like, I think that we belong under that umbrella, but I don't think that we can be fully active community members in everywhere. And the other thing is that like I get a little bit confused. Like, I don't know what it was like in Sydney in the 80s, but in the 90s, there were lesbian cafes, like one or two lesbian owned cafes. There were no lesbian pubs or clubs, or there was in Newtown, there was a gay male club called Top Gun that would either once a month or once every fortnight on a Friday night, they would have a women's night. So they would let lesbians come in and take the place over, which was fucking generous. And over time, that night was called Sirens. And over time, after a couple of years, they thought they built up a solid enough base because it like every time that Sirens was on, the place was pumping. It was packed. Like everyone went there, and then they opened their own club and it was never full. Like
Mm.
people started going, people went, they supported it pretty decently, but it was never jam packed. And then over time it dwindled, and then they ended up being shut down via a lawsuit. So like there's a lot of rhetoric about, like women's spaces, women's spaces, women's spaces in terms of lesbian spaces, but it kind of seems to me that like there's, and when you think about the way that lesbians get together, like they meet, they date for a couple of times, and then they couple fast and hard, and they kind of, depending on what ages they are, they don't necessarily then go out and socialize in club in the same way that men do, like gay men do, which means that they're busy nesting together and not supporting
Mhm.
businesses. So it's kind of like, is it really surprising in a number of ways? Like if there aren't, like if every lesbian doesn't feel like it is that part of their community duty to support the venues by going to them and spending money there, then is it really any surprise that the venues have slowly over time dwindled out, which is a separate issue to trans women, and
Yeah.
self-ID men invading them. Oh, and the other thing is that like the younger cohort now, like they have grown up in this queer phase. They seem to really like gay marriage normalized homosexuality, which means what should have happened is all of the ACONs and the prides and the ILGAs and all of the international LGBT organizations and activist mobs should have just been largely defunded. Like they were no longer necessary. Like, what are you doing? You have all your rights. Go home. Pack your shit up and
Yeah.
go home. Like, have a skeleton crew left over and put those funds somewhere else. That should have happened, but it didn't.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that like a lot of the younger lesbian people that I know don't think of themselves. They don't think of their sexuality as in any way, they just don't think about it. Like they're not
Yeah.
special, they're not separate, they just are, they kind of are accepted as a natural part of society. So they don't tend to go to lesbian only spaces. Like, well, there aren't any in Sydney, I'm pretty sure, but like I think that there needs to be, all the people that want them, they should have them. Absolutely, I'm not suggesting
Mhm.
otherwise, but it seems to me that like a lot of a lot of the way forward would probably more be mixed spaces, like having, gay male spaces, having lesbian spaces, having lots of mixed spaces, because it seems to me that a lot of the younger people seem to want mixed spaces. Like that's what they've come up with. Like
Yeah.
the age of, having, women only, women born women, like spaces just everywhere, like every lesbian space being woman only. Like I think that period of history may be over and it might not be coming back. I don't know, but I think that lesbians need to get together and have these discussions. And there's kind of this sense of like sometimes I hear a bit of entitlement, like when they're talking about all the butchers are transitioning, and it's like, well, that's a huge shame. Like, don't get me wrong, I think that's a travesty, and I hope that I would hope that everyone who does medicalize knows fully what they're doing, takes responsibility for themselves. I don't think that is the case, which is why it's such a huge problem, especially when they're being actively lied to. But I mean, if you don't treat people well, like there's kind of this expectation that butch women are there for them to date just because that's what they want, and it's like you're entitling yourself to someone else's life. There's a long history of butch women, masculine women, not being treated particularly well. Like,
Yeah. It frustrates me when there are GC women, GC lesbians in that discussion who want to end, they want lesbian spaces, they want lesbian community, and they want to end people medicalizing, but they're also disparaging of butches and butch femme relationships. It's like, well, you can't continue to treat butches like shit and not expect them
there seems to be,
to not still want to medicalize.
yeah, there's a certain level of entitlement around this that I personally find a little bit distasteful. Like I no longer belong to that. Like I'm no longer actively a lesbian, so it's not my place to, wade in and, you know be like, well,
Mhm.
I think blah 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 blah. But like from the things that I've seen over the last couple of years, being on gender critical Twitter, some of it's a bit overly entitled. Like we deserve spaces, and it's like, yeah, you do, but you have to go and create them, and you have to make sure that the people who want those spaces frequent them and support them. And
Yeah, the problem is the legal hurdle now, though, that they can't legally have those spaces. The more I talk about lesbian spaces, the more I realize how lucky I was because when I came out
mm,
and moved to Winnipeg, we had everything. Like we had a whole network to choose from. There was something for everybody. I mean, we had the longest running dyke bar in North America. It's a membership only club. It was small, but it was awesome and it ran for a long time. We had cafes, we had book collectives, we had well-established baseball leagues, like
mm,
art collectives, like just whoever you were, there was somewhere to tap into, and the bar was kind of the hub for all of those. All these different lesbian communities of very different, different people, but would all converge at the Dyke Bar. So if there would be like a lesbian film festival, for example, that would draw out all different kinds of lesbians, they'd all end up at the Dyke Bar afterwards, and you could actually interact with one another. So that the bar did a lot, I think,
yeah,
as a hub to keep the whole lesbian community together.
yeah, yeah. I mean, from my perspective, we need to challenge, like, the legal stuff is where it's at. The legal stuff and the educational stuff is, like, I've got documents where there's curriculum in the state of Victoria that basically says that kids are sexual from birth, like, and it's part of the curriculum. Like, it implies that human sexuality is the most important factor of human existence, and it's like, since when? Like,
Yeah.
you know, you don't need to cross off every sexual fantasy that you've ever had in
Well,
order to
and
be decent.
the ironic thing about all that, I mean, as much as these kids are being exposed to a very highly sexualized culture and that there are basically pornographic books in their school libraries teaching them things they do not need to know at that age. But at the same time, they themselves aren't really
Yeah,
sexual at all, that they're not actually in relationships, they're not dating, they're not having sex. So yeah, it's just this bizarre two parallel realities of, on one hand, a very highly sexualized culture and sexual information. I don't know what the relationship is like between that and the fact that they're not interested. Like maybe it's scaring them off, like what things they're being exposed to.
I,
Maybe it's overwhelming them. I don't know. And then the online spaces where they're not developing social skills. So it's probably a
no.
lot of factors, but it's,
I think the sexual content is actually actively traumatizing them because they're not ready for it. Like have a think about like your sexual awakening. Like mine happened in my mid-teen. If I had seen I had seen a flasher before that, but it wasn't titillating at all. It was kind of creepy. Like, the idea of having. Well, I was at Cats the other day actually doing a list of, because she wants to do an app, doing a list of inappropriate books that can be found in children's libraries. And the weird thing about books is that, like with movies, there are classifications.
yeah,
There's no age classifications for books. So,
that's a good point. Yeah.
like, there was a book called Gay BCs, because I was compiling a list of these inappropriate kids books. So if that book got made into if some of these books got made into movies, they would be R rated or AO or X rated movies. But because they're books, there's no rating system, so they're considered acceptable for kids, which is fucking outrageous.
It is. I was a presenter at a parent summit. It was like a national parent summit. So I was one of many speakers, and there was someone there who presented some of the books that they were finding in elementary schools. And they were like these graphic novels of very sexually explicit stuff, like teaching kids how to give blowjobs and have anal sex, and like in just
Yeah,
bizarre. It's just awful
like
that's what these kids are being exposed to.
schoolish. So it kind of doesn't.
5-year-old does not need to learn how to give a blowjob.
No, no. I had one that they were selling a big W that was like had fingering and just like all sorts of like just insanely inappropriate stuff. And the author was like, "Oh yeah, I'd let like a mature 8-year-old, thumb through this book. I'd be happy for that to be the case." And it's like, what are you doing? Like you're a mother. Like how could you possibly think that? Like it's gone too far. But yeah,
And these books, I mean, what the content that I've seen anyway, I mean, it's so focused on just certain acts, like teaching kids how to perform specific things,
mm,
but there's nothing about the relational aspects of sexuality at all, teaching about emotional intimacy
yeah,
and that's really what's missing, right? And I think because that is the nature of pornography in general, is
yeah,
that it's sexual acts devoid of love or affection or emotional intimacy. That's by definition what pornography is. So these just because they're drawings instead of videos or photographs, it's still just porn.
yeah. Yeah, there's a really interesting academic. It's either M.E. O'Brien or Sophie Lewis. Have you heard of her? She
No.
um she is an abolish the family feminist who is like just hardcore Marxist, like straight up like she wrote one of them wrote, I can't remember which one. It was either Emmy O'Brien or Sophie Lewis, but I watched a video where she was going, where whoever it was going through their abolish the family book, and they are basically describing like a complete communist state, um, and talking about like separating kids from the family, like liberating parents from having to raise their own kids and stuff like that. It's really revolting. But a lot of this stuff is like thinking
Who
about it.
does she think should be raising the kids? Like hiring nannies and stuff?
No, no, the state welfare, state care. They think the government
Oh,
should be like, and a lot of the curriculum is set up that way as well. Like it is when you look at it, it's full on Marxism. Like there's no hiding it. Like reading Building Respectful Relationships, which is part of the stuff from Victoria, which is curricular type material from Victoria. Like you're reading it and it spans, like it takes up, there was like one unit, it's made up of 3 units, this one book that I read, and there's a number of books for year 8 and year 9. It's made up of 3 units. One unit takes up 2,700 minutes of class time.
wow.
So what else are they learning? Like
Yeah,
when you actually go and listen to the activists, like the queer activists who are actively showing up, because it's always moderates stay home. Like that this is one of the problems that we actually have of how we got here, is that if you are a moderate person with moderate political views, you're not on fire for your moderate political views. You just have common sense, run of the mill, probably center left, center right, like which means there's not a lot of difference between those two positions necessarily. You don't go out and set the world on fire for your moderate politics. Like the people who show up to do this activism stuff are hardcore, anarchist types, like outright communists who really want to change the world. And like I kind of see part of these, like the unacceptable content in these books at kids' schools, is part of the sexual liberation movement as well. Like it is a porn category, but I kind of think maybe like the overarching how we got here for that is it is still under the umbrella of sexual freedom and sexual liberation, because they're really pushing for, kids are sexual from birth, which means that if kids are sexual from birth, then it means that we're oppressing them by not giving them the
right.
opportunity to express
Yeah.
their
But
sexuality.
really, all it's doing is creating more deviant sexuality.
Well, and I mean, it's turning the kids off. Like we're hearing stories about in the turning off section, like under that umbrella, we're hearing stories because we have like feelers in lots of different schools in the state. We're hearing stories about kids that are, like bursting into tears at pictures that they're not ready to see, etc., etc., and just being traumatized by the content.
Awful. And going back to the point about the idea of like a state-run child rearing, I mean, all that would do, I mean, that's we see similar things in our Canadian foster care system. All it would do is raise a generation of psychopaths who are incapable of emotional bonding.
The problem is with a lot of this Marxist stuff is that the people that are doing it, and I used to, like I was a socialist up until, I jumped on GC Twitter basically, is when I started to realize, oh, progressive politics are the problem here. So I would have thought, oh yeah, that's really good, blah, 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 blah. The problem is that they assume the best of human nature. Like they assume that the people that are running these things are going to be benign and, oversee things with a good heart. But the reality of history shows us that the people that rise to the top in these situations are the most sociopathic, psychopathic, sadistic, like the people who are willing to go above and beyond in terms of just,
Yeah.
brutalizing people, etc., is what actually happens.
Our government a number of years ago, quite a few years ago now, made some changes to our foster care system where they felt it was traumatizing for kids to bond with a family and then have to move because foster care isn't always permanent.
Mm.
So they came up with this really stupid idea that they would set a time limit in order to prevent them getting attached to a family, they would just move them kind of on a schedule from one family to another, to another, to another, to another, where they just then didn't emotionally bond with anybody. And it psychologically crippled all of those kids.
Fucking hell. That's such a bad idea. And you can see, like, in practice, it's such a bad idea, but you can see that the people that came up with it thought that they
They
were
were
being,
well-meaning. Yeah, they just thought, well, we don't want to traumatize these poor kids, ripping them apart from families after they bond with them. So we'll just prevent them from developing the emotional capacity to bond with anybody, because that's better.
like, what the fuck? So you now have a generation of psychotic, like, foster kids. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, it just is the same thing over and over again. I kind of am starting to swing very, very, very conservative in my political thinking because, like, it kind of feels like you tweeted about this the other day. It kind of feels like, in terms of the most humane, the most organized societal structure, Christianity kind of has down. Like, I'd love to say otherwise, but like, I don't even really, I don't believe that God exists. I kind of think that man invented God, and I think that very smart people centuries ago saw societies rise and fall over, a number of hundreds or thousands of years, and realized, no, no, this is the structure that works. Like, if you do that, you go here. But in the modern age, we kind of are so disconnected from the lessons of history, and we're so convinced that we're just on this endward progressive up cycle, that we can just continuously change and alter all of the basic foundational moral systems that are in place, and they'll just, there won't be any second or third knock on negative consequences. And it's like, that's turning out to be very not true. Like,
Mhm.
wow, we've kind of run the gamut, haven't we?
Yeah, we've run a while, so we should probably wrap up, but it's been a great conversation. We should do it again soon.
Yeah,